Welcome to another GnuCash Quick Start tutorial. I'm Laura from thebusybeepost.com, and today's topic is actually a continuation of creating business invoices in GnuCash free accounting software part 2. If you like my tutorials and find them helpful, please subscribe and don't forget to give a thumbs up. I would appreciate it, and it lets me know I'm being helpful, which encourages me to want to do more. Let's begin. In part one of creating GnuCash invoices, I talked about 4 things you need to have in place before you begin creating invoices, such as the sales tax, registering your business in the system, setting up your accounting period, and your billing terms. And I showed you how to set up those GnuCash features. If you haven't already reviewed tutorial 1, I would suggest you go back and review it now so that it will make it easier to follow this tutorial, creating invoices in GnuCash part 2. Now in part 2 of creating invoices, I will be focusing on accounts receivables. As I mentioned in the first tutorial, invoicing in accounting terms is a part of accounts receivables. Accounts receivable is money that's owed to you, such as your invoice to clients. Sales invoices serve as an official record of a sale for both the buyer and the seller. GnuCash has an integrated accounts receivable system. It is within this account that the integrated account receivable system will place transactions. You generally do not work directly with this account. You generally work with the 4 integrated GnuCash accounts receivable application components, which I will go into detail in this tutorial. Let's begin. As you can see here, I'm starting out with a 0 balance in accounts receivable, and I will be walking you through the steps from start to finish, from entering the customer invoice to processing the payment. In step 1 of creating invoices in GnuCash, you will create the customer's profile and select how billing terms and sales tax applies to this customer. You start by registering your customer in the system. To register a new customer, from the menu bar, select Business, Customer, New Customer. Here in the New Customer window is the basic information you would expect to find on any invoice. I will point out a couple of things here. Under the identification section, you have customer number. This can be any number by which you would like to refer to this customer, or you can use the counters feature I talked about in part 1 to change the default numbering, or you can simply leave it blank and a new number will be chosen automatically for you. Next, the company name is a required field. If you're selling to an individual, then use the individual's name in the company field. The active option is checked by default. This option separates the active customers from the inactive ones. This is useful when you have many past customers and you want to see only those that are marked active. The billing address is pretty self-explanatory. In the name field, as long as you have the company name on the or the individual's name filled in above, the name here under billing address is optional. But the address is a required field. But the funny thing is, the system doesn't care if you put in a full address or half of an address, but you need to put something in the address field. The email, phone, and fax are optional. Down in the notes field, the note field is for your personal use. Whatever you want to jot down to remember about this customer, you will put it here in the notes field. Next, you need to enter the billing information. Click on the billing information tab. Here you have the currency which will be used on your invoices. It should default to the default currency already set up in the system, which you selected when you were installing the program. Billing terms is the default billing terms for this customer. This is where you will use the billing terms you set up using the billing terms editor, which I walked you through in the first tutorial. Use the drop down arrow to select the terms already pre-registered in the system. Discount gives the customer a default percentage based discount at the time of invoice creation. You can override the default discount. The credit limit stores the maximum credit you are willing to extend to the customer. This field is for your reference purposes only. The value is not used by GnuCash. In this tutorial, we're not going to focus on discounts or credit limits. We will move on to sales tax. Under tax included, if you sell taxable products and you know for a fact this particular customer is one of the customers who you are required to collect sales tax from for the products or service you sell to them. For instance, if you're an online seller, it could be a customer who lives in a state where your business resides, which would be in most cases, a taxable customer. Here is where you can select the sales tax table you set up for taxable customers in part 1 of this tutorial on creating invoices. Use the drop-down arrow to select No, meaning the sales tax is not included in the invoice amount. Next, click on the checkbox next to Tax Table to select it. Then click on the drop-down arrow on the right-hand side to see your options and select the sales tax table you set up for your customers you are required to collect sales tax from. Next, select the Shipping tab. The shipping address records the customer's shipping address if it is different from the billing address. The shipping address is for your references only. Unfortunately, it doesn't affect what will appear on the invoice. When the billing address and the shipping address is different, you will have to choose which address you prefer to have displayed on the invoice. The address you want to appear on the invoice must be entered in the billing address field. When you have finished editing the customer profile, select OK to finish up and close out the dialog box. Step 2. You will create the customer's invoice and post it. Now it's time to set up the physical invoice you will send to a customer to request payment. To create an invoice, select from the menu bar, Business, and when the menu opens, select Customer, then New Invoice. In the Invoice Information section, Type refers to the type of customer document to create. You can create either an invoice or a credit note here. In this tutorial, we will be focusing on creating an invoice. Invoice should be selected by default. If not, select it. The invoice ID or identification number is your internal number for this invoice. You can leave it blank and an invoice number will be generated automatically for you. Date opened, the date this invoice was created. By default, the present date is entered. If you would like to change the date, click on the drop-down arrow to bring up the calendar you can use to change the date. Customer, of course, is the customer who will receive this invoice. If you remember the company name or individual's name you entered for this customer, start to type it in the text box, and GnuCash will try to auto-complete it for you. In most cases, this will work. Here I see the company I entered. But if entering a few letters of the company or individual's names fails, you will have to use the GnuCash Find tool by clicking on the Select tab to bring up the Find tool you will use to search for and select the customer. The GnuCash Find tool is a useful tool you will find yourself using quite frequently. Therefore, I want to take a moment to show you the basics of how to use it to do a simple search. With the Find Customer window open, on the left-hand side, you can choose what method you want to search for by clicking on the drop-down arrow and selecting your choice. In the search text box, instead of entering the full name, you can start by entering a few letters of the company or individual's name you are searching for and click on Find to see if the system will produce a result. Once the company or individual's information appears in the search results, highlight the customer information and press the Select button. This will bring you back to the new Invoice window, and here you can see the company's name has been filled in automatically for you. Billing ID. Here you can reference the customer's purchase order number or other customer reference number you will use to identify your invoices for this customer. Billing terms. Here you can select the billing terms agreement for this invoice. For the billing term to be listed here, it must be registered in the system through the billings term editor. Using the drop-down arrow, you can select the special billing terms you want to apply to this particular invoice. Since I selected the billing terms I want to apply to this customer when I set up the customer's profile, the system automatically updated the billing terms options here when I selected this customer. In the notes section, you can enter internal notes for your eyes only. When you click on the OK button, the Edit Invoice window opens. Here is where you will enter an itemized list of goods and services you sold to this customer. The layout is similar to the way the account register works. The date field is the date this item was sold. In the description field, enter a description of the item or service. Action is a user-defined field. In other words, you can enter your cost information here, or you can click on the drop-down arrow and select one of the 3 predefined actions. Your choice depends on the item or service you are invoicing for. Is it based on charges by the hour, on a material item, or a project? This field is optional, meaning if you don't want to enter anything here or use the predefined options, you can leave it blank. In the next field, you will select the income account associated with this invoice. You can click on the drop-down arrow to select from the chart of accounts the income transaction this invoice applies to, such as sales. In the quantity field, enter the amount of this item you are selling. I entered 40 since I am selling 40 pairs of purse handles. In the unit price field, enter the unit price for each one of the items. For example, I entered here the cost of each pair of purse handles, which is $3.95. The next 2 fields apply to the discount you are applying to this invoice, a dollar amount or a discount percentage. Leaving it blank means no discount will be applied. Any default discount you specified for this customer will automatically be entered for each item. Since I am not offering any discounts on this order, I will leave the fields blank. The next 3 fields is where you will specify how sales taxes you charge your customers is handled. Now, since I knew this was a customer I needed to charge taxes for when I set up this customer's profile, I pre-selected the sales tax table for this customer that I set up for my taxable customers. And the system has automatically updated this invoice as if it were for a taxable customer. In the taxable field, an X has already been entered here for me. X means yes, this item is taxable. If the field were blank, it would mean no, this invoice item is not taxable. If the item was not taxable, clicking on the field box, you can toggle between the settings. Since in this example, the items being sold to this customer are taxable, I will leave the X in this field. In the tax included field, a blank field means no. No taxes has been included in the unit price. An X in this box would mean yes, the tax has already been included in the unit price. Since in this example, no taxes has been included in the unit price of the product, for this invoice, I will leave this field blank. In the sales tax table field, the system automatically updated the tax table field with the sales tax table I selected to be used with this customer's invoices. The sales tax table uses the information you entered when you set up the tax table to determine the amount of sales taxes to charge the customer and the transaction account to post this sales tax transaction to. Now, if you need to manually configure an invoice you want to apply taxable items to, make sure the tax table field has an X in it and select your sales tax table by clicking on the drop-down arrow to bring up the available tax tables you previously set up in the system. In the first part of this tutorial, creating business invoices in GnuCash, I showed you how to set up customer sales tax tables. Here is where you can select that table to apply to an invoice. Okay, it's time to see if the sales tax table is working. In the subtotal field, the subtotal is a system-generated subtotal for this item without any tax included. You cannot edit these subtotals. The total invoice amount for 40 purse handle sets at $3.95 each comes to $158 as shown here. It is correct. Now let's check the sales tax. The sales tax is system generated and also cannot be edited. Okay, let's see the sales tax I'm required to collect from my customer is 6%. 158 times 6% sales tax equals $9.48 as shown here. It is correct. Everything so far looks good. Now, when you're finished editing the invoice, you are ready to post the invoice. The invoice doesn't have to be posted immediately. In fact, according to GnuCash instructions, you should only post an invoice when you are ready to print it. Posting an invoice places the transaction into the accounts receivables account. To post the invoice, select Post on the toolbar. Here my post icon is hidden, so I have to use the down arrow on the far right hand side of the toolbar to bring it up. You may not be able to see it, but know that it's there. Once I click on the Post tab, a dialog box should appear asking if I want to save the changes. Agree, and now you should see the Post Invoice window appear. The post date is the date this transaction entered into the accounts receivable account. By default, this is the invoice date opened. Due date is the date on which payment for the invoice is expected. If you specified payment terms when you created the invoice, the date is calculated according to the selected terms. If you did not select any terms, you can specify the payment terms by entering the expected payment due date here. In the description field, unless there's something you specifically want to say about this invoice, you can leave it blank. Description is an arbitrary description. When invoice transactions are placed in the accounts receivable account, this description is entered into the memo field. Post to account selects the accounts receivable account in which invoice transactions are posted. You can select the account from a list of existing accounts receivable accounts, but unless you have more than one accounts receivable account, your default accounts receivable account should be selected here. Accumulate splits determines if invoice items which transfer to the same account are combined into a single split for that account or entered individually. Okay, I know it sounds a little confusing, so let's look at how it works. For example, if the accumulate splits box is left checked, invoices with more than one item listed on the invoice which transfers to the same account, such as income sales, are combined into a single split and the full sales amount is entered into income sales. If you uncheck the accumulate splits box, then the invoice items which transfer to the same account, such as income sales, are entered separately into the income sales account, as shown here. And in the memo field, it specifies the items. This does not affect how the invoice items appear on the invoice, only how the invoice split transactions are handled when it transfers into the income sales account. It's your choice. I prefer to leave the default accumulate splits box checked so that the full amount of an invoice with more than one split transactions are combined into a single split and entered into the income sales account. Once you're finished setting up your options, click OK to save the changes. Now that the invoice has been officially posted, if I look at my accounts receivable account, I can see the full amount of the invoice, $167.48, has been entered into the accounts receivable account, awaiting payment for the invoice. The next step is to print the invoice for the customer. To print an invoice, select Print on the toolbar. This displays the printed version of the invoice as shown here. Now you can select the print icon on the toolbar to print out a hard copy for your customer, or you can use the print option to save it as a PDF file to email to your customers. We are now in step 3. Now it's time to process the customer's payment. Once you receive payment for an invoice from your customer, it's time to process the payment. To process an invoice payment, select from the menu bar Business, then Customer, then Process Payment. The Process Payment window opens. Under the Post To account, the accounts receivable account to post this transaction to should be selected here. Customer is the customer who paid you. If you remember the company name you entered in the new customer window for this customer, start to type it into the text box and GnuCash will try to auto-complete it for you. As I said earlier, this normally works, but if it doesn't, you will have to search for the customer. If you need to search for the customer, Use the same method we used earlier in this tutorial to search for the customer. Start by clicking on the Select tab to bring up the Find window you will use to search for and select the customer. Once the customer is entered here, you should see the customer's invoice listed below. Select the invoice you want to apply payment to by clicking on it to highlight it. In the transaction details section, date is the date you receive payment. By default, the present day is displayed. If you need to change it, you can click on the drop-down arrow to bring up the calendar you can use to change the date. Payment amount is the amount of money received. By default, the full amount of the invoice is entered here. GnuCash does accept partial payments. Num here is where you can enter a check number if it applies. Here in the memo field, you can enter any comments about this payment. Transfer account is the account where the money will be deposited. For example, the checking account. Click on the small arrows on the left-hand side to open up the sub-accounts. Here, I will select the checking account to transfer the payment of this invoice to. When you are finished with your changes, select OK to save the changes. Now, if you go back to the accounts receivable account, you will find a zero balance, which is the way it should be. Because you are no longer waiting on the payment has already been processed. You may remember I mentioned customer jobs being a part of the accounts receivable system, but I didn't cover customer jobs in this tutorial because customer jobs is an optional feature, and I just wanted to focus more on giving you the basic knowledge you needed to begin creating invoices and processing the payments. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please subscribe.